Viewer discretion is advised. This presentation contains graphic descriptions of violence and details a real-life unsolved murder case. The content may be disturbing to some audiences. His jaw was broken in 2 places. His face a mask of dried blood and contusions. His cheekbones were fractured. When they found him lying on top of the collapsed tent, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently. He was the only one left alive. And for the next 44 years, the nation of Finland would ask itself one terrifying question. Was Nils Gustafsson the final victim of the Lake Bodom massacre? Or was he the monster who committed it? This is a story that defies easy answers. A story that begins with the simple, youthful promise of a summer weekend and ends in a vortex of brutality that has haunted a country for over 60 years. It's a case so infamous, it has become Finland's national nightmare. A campfire story that happens to be horrifyingly true. The date is June 4, 1960. The place, Lake Bodom, a serene and popular camping spot just a short drive from Helsinki. 4 teenagers decide to kick off their summer with an overnight trip. There's 15-year-old Mila Ermeli Björklund and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Seppo Antero Boiman. And with them are another young couple, 15-year-old Anja Tulikimaki and her boyfriend, 18-year-old Nils Gustafsson. They were just kids. 2 young couples likely sneaking away from their parents, filled with the kind of reckless optimism that only belongs to the young. They rode their motorcycles out to the Cape, a small peninsula jutting into the placid waters of the lake, and pitched their tent. They were looking for a night of freedom, a brief escape. They had no idea they were setting up their own tomb. What happened between the time they zipped up their tent for the night and the moment the sun rose the next morning is a puzzle built from fragmented memories, contradictory evidence, and pure unadulterated violence. The attack was not quiet. It was not surgical. It was savage. Sometime between 4 and 6 in the morning on June 5th, an unknown assailant or assailants descended upon the tent. They didn't unzip the flap. They didn't announce their presence. They began their assault from the outside, slashing and stabbing through the canvas walls with a knife, and bludgeoning the teenagers inside with a heavy, blunt object, likely a rock or a pipe. The victims were trapped, attacked through the very fabric of their shelter, with no chance to see their killer and no way to escape. The first people to stumble upon the scene weren't police. At around 6 in the morning, a group of young boys out birdwatching saw the collapsed tent from a distance. They also saw something else that struck them as odd. A blond man walking away from the scene. They didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a man on a Sunday morning near a lake. They didn't approach the tent. They didn't know they had just witnessed the ghost at the center of Finland's greatest mystery. It wasn't until 11 a.m., 5 long hours later, that the true horror was discovered. A carpenter named Esko Oiva Johansson was out for a swim when he saw the wreckage. He got closer. He saw a man's shoe, then another. He saw the blood. He saw the bodies. Mila, Anja, and Seppo were dead. They had been bludgeoned and stabbed with a frenzy that spoke of rage, not robbery. Mila Björklund, Seppo's girlfriend, was found lying on top of the tent, undressed from the waist down. She had suffered the most injuries, stabbed multiple times even after she was already dead. The violence inflicted upon her was personal, extreme. Seppo and Anja were found inside the bloody, shredded remains of the tent. And then there was Nils, lying on top of the tent with Mila, brutalized but breathing. The scene was chaos. The local police were called, but they were unprepared for a crime of this magnitude. Crucial mistakes were made almost immediately. The scene wasn't properly cordoned off. Curious onlookers trampled through the area. They even called in soldiers from a nearby base to help with the search, and in their effort to be helpful, they contaminated a crime scene that was already a mess. It was a catastrophic failure from the very start, one that would cripple the investigation for decades to come. The killer had left behind a strange collection of clues and contradictions. The murder weapons, the knife and the blunt object were gone. They have never been found. The killer had also stolen several items from the victims, but the choices were bizarre. The keys to their motorcycles were taken, but the motorcycles themselves were left behind. The killer took Nils's and Seppo's wallets, but left Anja's purse, which likely contained money. Most strangely, the killer stole Nils Gustafsson's shoes. Why? Why take the shoes of a victim you've left for dead? Police would later find some of the stolen items, including the shoes, hidden almost half a mile away from the campsite. But the wallets and the murder weapons remained lost to the forest. The motive was a complete mystery. It didn't seem like a robbery gone wrong. The killer ignored obvious valuables. It didn't seem like a crime of passion because who was the target? The attack was indiscriminate, aimed at everyone inside the tent. Investigators were staring at a phantom, an attacker who appeared in the pre-dawn light, unleashed hell, and then vanished into the woods, leaving behind 3 dead teenagers, 1 barely alive, and a country demanding answers. The police were desperate. They chased down hundreds of leads. They investigated a man known as Kiosk Man, Carl Valdemar Gillstrom, who ran a small food stand near the lake. Gillstrom was known to be aggressive, to hate campers, and had even been seen filling in a well on his property the day after the murders. Years later, on his deathbed, he allegedly confessed to the crime, but police had questioned him back in 1960 and cleared him. His wife gave him an alibi, saying he was in bed with her, though she later admitted she was awake and afraid of him that night. Was it him? A disgruntled local with a violent temper? The evidence was purely circumstantial. They looked into another suspect, Hans Assmann, an alleged former KGB spy who lived in the area. Assmann showed up at a Helsinki hospital the day after the murders, his clothes covered in red stains, his fingernails black with dirt. He was incoherent and aggressive. A doctor who treated him later claimed he recognized Assmann from news reports about the Bodom killer. But again, the lead went cold. The trail was littered with ghosts and what-ifs. But through all the theories, all the suspects, all the dead ends, the investigation always circled back to the one person who was there. The one person who survived. Nils Gustafsson. From the very beginning, his story was strange. In the hospital, suffering from a concussion and severe facial fractures, he claimed he had almost no memory of the attack. He remembered fragments. A flash of light. A figure dressed in black with bright red eyes, attacking them from above. His memory was a jumble of trauma-induced amnesia and what sounded like a nightmare. But investigators noted oddities. While his girlfriend and his 2 friends were slaughtered, his own injuries, while serious, were less severe. And then there was the blood evidence. Or rather, the lack of it. For a man who was supposedly attacked inside the tent, there was very little of his blood found inside. And his shoes found half a mile away. How did they get there if he was incapacitated on top of the tent? For years, these were just nagging questions, inconsistencies in a tragic story of survival. Nils Gustafsson was seen as a victim, the boy who lived. He went on to live a normal life. He got a job, got married, had children. He was the sole survivor of a national tragedy. But the police never completely let go of their suspicions. The file remained open. The questions remained unanswered. And then, in 2004, 44 years after the murders, everything changed. New DNA technology allowed investigators to re-examine the evidence. They tested Nils's shoes, the ones found hidden in the woods. And on them, they found the blood of the other 3 victims, but none of Nils's own. The implication was staggering. The shoes weren't worn during the attack. They were hidden after. And there was only one person who could have done that. In March of 2004, the boy who survived the Lake Bodom murders, now a man in his 60s, was arrested and charged with killing his friends. The victim had officially become the prime suspect. The news sent a shockwave across Finland. For 44 years, Nils Gustafsson was the boy who lived, the tragic sole survivor of an inexplicable national horror. He was a figure of sympathy, a living ghost from a nightmare that had never truly ended. Now, in the blink of an eye, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, the NBI, was recasting him as the monster of that nightmare. The public was stunned. How could this be? Why now, after more than 4 decades of dead ends and silence? The answer, the NBI claimed, lay in a revolution that hadn't existed in 1960. A revolution in science. In the early 2000s, investigators decided to throw the full weight of modern forensic technology at the Bodom case file. They painstakingly re-examined every shred of evidence that had been meticulously preserved since that bloody June morning. They analyzed the torn tent fabric, the blood-soaked sleeping bags, and the clothing of the victims. And it was here, in the microscopic world of DNA, that they believed they found the key. The results were electrifying. They found DNA from all 4 teenagers as expected, but it was the location of the DNA that formed the cornerstone of the prosecution's new theory. Inside the tent, investigators found the blood of the 3 murdered teenagers, Seppo, Tiliki, and Ermeli, but they found no trace of an unknown 5th person. No unidentified male DNA. No phantom killer. Even more damning was what they found on the outside of the tent. There they discovered bloodstains that belonged to only one person, Nils Gustafsson. Think about that for a moment. The victim's blood was exclusively on the inside. Nils's blood was on the outside. The prosecution seized on this. This, they argued, was not the pattern of an outside attacker breaking in. This was the pattern of someone who was already outside the tent when the bloodshed began. This single piece of forensic evidence flipped the entire narrative on its head. Suddenly, the image of a crazed madman slashing through the canvas from the outside began to dissolve. It was replaced by a far more intimate and disturbing picture. A picture of a killer who was one of their own. With this new forensic anchor, investigators began to re-examine every other piece of the puzzle. And suddenly old, confusing details began to click into place, forming a coherent, terrifying story. A story of teenage jealousy, alcohol, and explosive rage. The prosecution's theory began hours before the murders. The 4 teenagers were drinking. Tensions, they argued, were running high. Nils had a crush on Ermeli, but Ermeli was there with her boyfriend Seppo. According to this new narrative, a drunken argument erupted between Nils and Seppo. It became heated, physical. The fight spilled out of the tent, and at some point Seppo, the stronger of the 2, kicked Nils out, telling him to stay out. Humiliated, enraged, and drunk, Nils didn't just walk away. He stewed. In the darkness by the lake, his teenage frustration curdled into a murderous fury. He grabbed a blunt object, likely a rock from the shoreline, and a knife. He then returned to the tent, not as a friend, but as an executioner. He didn't need to cut his way in. He simply attacked the thin canvas from the outside, striking blindly and brutally at the sleeping forms within. He knew exactly where they were. First, he allegedly struck Seppo, the source of his rage. Then he turned on the 2 girls, unleashing his fury on Ermeli, the object of his unrequited affection, and Tiliki, an innocent bystander in the wrong place at the wrong time. The savagery of the attack was explained by this explosion of personal rage. It wasn't random. It was targeted. After the frenzy was over, the prosecution claimed Nils's adrenaline-fueled rage was replaced by the cold, clear panic of what he had just done. He knew he couldn't escape, so he began to stage the scene. This is where the other strange pieces of evidence came into play. Remember the missing items? The killer had stolen wallets, some clothing, and most bizarrely Nils's shoes. Why would an outside attacker take the shoes of one victim but leave other valuables behind? It made no sense. But for the prosecution, it made perfect sense if Nils was the killer. He needed to create the illusion of a robbery gone wrong. He needed to create a phantom. So he took his own shoes, likely covered in the mud and blood of his rampage, and walked nearly 500 meters, a third of a mile, into the woods. He hid them there, along with the murder weapons, pushing them under some rocks. He got rid of the evidence that would directly tie him to the crime. Then came the final, most crucial part of the act: his own injuries. The broken jaw, the concussion, the stab wounds. The defense had always pointed to these as proof of his victimhood, but the prosecution now offered a chilling alternative. They argued that most of Nils's injuries were superficial and could have been self-inflicted. The cuts were hesitant, not the decisive, brutal wounds inflicted on his friends. As for the more serious injuries like the broken jaw, the prosecution suggested that could have happened earlier, during the initial fistfight with Seppo, before the murders even took place. Once the evidence was hidden and his injuries were established, Nils, according to this theory, stumbled back towards the crime scene and collapsed, waiting to be found. He wasn't a victim who had miraculously survived an attack. He was a killer who had meticulously crafted an alibi. To bolster their case, prosecutors even brought forward new witness testimony. A woman came forward claiming that, back in 1960, she had been camping nearby and had overheard a heated argument coming from the teen's tent. Another witness, a local farmer, claimed he saw a blonde young man, a man he believed was Nils, walking away from the campsite early in the morning, long before the bodies were discovered. For the first time in 44 years, the state of Finland believed they had a complete story. A motive, sexual jealousy. A sequence of events. A fight, an expulsion from the tent, and a vengeful return. An explanation for the bizarre evidence. The location of the blood, the hiding of the shoes, the nature of the injuries. It was a compelling and deeply personal story of betrayal. The lone survivor hadn't been lucky. He had been cunning. The case was officially reopened, and the trial of the century in Finland was about to begin. The prosecution presented its case to the world, confident that the combination of modern DNA science and a re-evaluation of the old evidence had finally solved the enduring mystery of Lake Bodom. They believed their narrative was airtight, a closed loop of rage, murder, and deception. But they had made a critical miscalculation. In their focus on building a new story, they had failed to properly re-examine the foundation of the old one. The defense team, now fighting for Nils Gustafsson's life, began to dig through the dusty 44-year-old police files. And buried deep within the original autopsy reports, they found a single explosive detail. A forensic observation made by the medical examiner back in 1960 that had been overlooked for decades. A detail that didn't just contradict the prosecution's theory, it threatened to shatter it completely. The medical examiner's report from 1960 noted that Nils Gustafsson had a fractured jaw. Not a bruise, not a cut, a clean, undeniable fracture of the mandible, accompanied by a concussion and multiple contusions. This wasn't a superficial wound. This was a disabling, agonizing injury, and it flew in the face of everything the prosecution was trying to build. Their entire case rested on the idea that Nils flew into a jealous rage, murdered his friends, and then in a moment of cold, calculated cunning, inflicted a few minor wounds on himself to play the victim. But you don't break your own jaw. You don't give yourself a concussion. These are not the injuries of a killer trying to create a cover story. These are the injuries of a victim who fought back against a brutal, overpowering force. The defense team seized on this. They argued that for Nils to have sustained these injuries, he must have been attacked by the same unknown assailant who murdered his friends. The prosecution, caught off guard by this 40-year-old detail, scrambled for an explanation. Their theory, that after killing everyone, Nils, in his fabricated hysteria, stumbled around in the dark and fell, breaking his jaw on a rock. Think about that for a second. The state's argument was that this teenage boy had just committed a triple homicide, methodically hiding his shoes and the murder weapon, but was also clumsy enough to trip and shatter his own face. It was a weak, almost desperate attempt to patch a gaping hole in their narrative. The defense painted a much more plausible and much more terrifying picture. They argued that the severity of Nils's injuries proved one thing beyond a shadow of a doubt. There was a fifth person at the lake that night. An intruder. A killer who attacked the tent from the outside, incapacitating the victims before they even knew what was happening. This theory aligned perfectly with other pieces of evidence that had been ignored for decades. Remember the eyewitnesses? The two young boys who were birdwatching from a distance. They testified that they saw the tent collapse around 7 a.m. But they also testified that they saw a blond man walking away from the campsite. Nils Gustafsson was found inside the collapsed tent, unconscious and bleeding. He wasn't the man they saw walking away. So who was he? The defense argued that the police had been so fixated on Nils from the very beginning, both in 1960 and again in 2004, that they had suffered from a severe case of tunnel vision. They had ignored a mountain of evidence that pointed away from the lone survivor and towards an unknown, external attacker. An attacker who, after committing the atrocity, simply picked up the murder weapon, gathered the victims' wallets and Nils's shoes, and vanished into the woods. This is where the story takes a turn, away from the courtroom and back to the dark woods surrounding Lake Bodom. Because there was a man who lived near the lake. A man who ran a small kiosk selling drinks and snacks to campers. A man who was known to have a furious, almost pathological hatred for those very campers. His name was Carl Valdemar Gillström, but he was better known to locals as the Kiosk Man. Gillström was a deeply troubled and aggressive individual. Locals told stories of him sneaking around campsites at night, cutting tent ropes, throwing rocks at people, and screaming at them to get off his land, even though it wasn't his land. He saw the teenagers who flocked to the lake as a personal affront, a blight on his quiet existence. He was the bogeyman of Lake Bodom, the angry hermit in the woods that parents warned their children about. And on the night of the murders, several witnesses reported seeing him near the campsite, agitated and angry. But the police in 1960 had dismissed him. Why? because Gyllström had an alibi. His wife, who by all accounts was terrified of him, told investigators that he had been home with her, sound asleep the entire night. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene and a seemingly solid alibi, the police moved on. Gyllström was just another dead end, and for years that's where his story ended. He lived out the rest of his short, angry life, dying by suicide in 1969, just 9 years after the murders. It seemed his secrets, if he had any, had died with him, but they hadn't. Years later, a neighbor of Gyllström's came forward with a chilling story. He claimed that shortly before Gyllström took his own life, the kiosk man showed up at his house, drunk and distraught, and in that drunken stupor, he confessed. He allegedly told the neighbor, "I'm the one who did it." He confessed to the Lake Bodom murders. It was a bombshell revelation, a deathbed confession from the one man who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to commit the crime. This should have been the key that unlocked the entire mystery. But when this information was relayed to the police, it was once again met with skepticism. A drunken confession, they argued, is hardly reliable, and besides, he still had that alibi. His wife had sworn he was home. The case was closed, but the story gets even darker. After Gyllström's death, his widow reportedly told others a different story. Freed from the fear of her abusive husband, she allegedly admitted to friends that he had, in fact, been out of the house that night. She claimed he had threatened to kill her if she ever told the police the truth. She said that when he finally came home in the early hours of the morning, his clothes were wet and covered in dirt. She even remembered him telling her to never mention where he had been. He had constructed his own alibi using the one person who was too scared to defy him. Even more disturbing, Gyllström's wife mentioned that after his confession to the neighbor, he came home and told her he was going to drown himself in the lake, so the truth would be drowned with him. Before he did, he filled in the family well in their yard with rocks and dirt. Why? What was he trying to hide? For years, rumors swirled that he had hidden the murder weapon and the stolen items from the victims at the bottom of that well, sealing it forever just before he died. So now, in 2004, as Nils Gustafsson sat in a courtroom, the defense presented this alternative theory. They pointed the finger squarely at the ghost of Carl Valdemar Gyllström. Here was a violent, unstable man with a known hatred for campers. A man who allegedly confessed to the crime. A man whose alibi was provided by a terrified wife who later cast serious doubt on her own testimony. A man who just before his death went to extreme lengths to seal a potential hiding place for the murder weapon. The prosecution was now facing a nightmare scenario. Their case against Nils was built on circumstantial evidence and a questionable psychological theory. The defense, meanwhile, had just presented a compelling, terrifying alternative. They had given the jury a monster, a real-life bogeyman who had haunted the shores of Lake Bodom for years. The question was no longer just about Nils Gustafsson's guilt or innocence. The trial had resurrected the specter of another man, one who couldn't defend himself or be cross-examined because he was long dead. The jury was left to weigh the prosecution's theory of a teenage love triangle gone wrong against the defense's story of a random, savage attack by a local madman. And the evidence for both was frustratingly thin, buried under more than 4 decades of rumor, flawed memories, and lost evidence. The kiosk man theory was powerful, but it was still just that, a theory. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon found in his well, because the police never thought to look there. They had their man in 1960, and they had their man again in 2004. But as the trial wore on, it was becoming increasingly clear that the only thing anyone could be certain of was that on a cold June morning in 1960, something truly evil had happened in that tent. And the person responsible might not even be in the room. The prosecution's case against Nils Gustafsson, meticulously built over 2 years, was supposed to be a slam dunk. They had modern DNA technology, a motive as old as time itself, and what they believed was a killer hiding in plain sight for over 4 decades. But as the defense began to pick it apart, piece by agonizing piece, the case started to look less like a fortress and more like a house of cards in a hurricane. Let's start with the shoes. This was the prosecution's smoking gun. A pair of light-colored leather shoes, identified as belonging to Nils, had been found about 500 meters from the campsite. When tested in the early 2000s, forensic scientists found bloodstains on them. And in those stains, they found DNA from all 3 of the deceased victims. Seppo, Tillicki, and Ermeli. But crucially, they did not find DNA from Nils Gustafsson. To the prosecution, the story was simple. Nils, in a jealous rage, attacks his friends from outside the tent. He gets their blood on his shoes. Afterward, he takes them off and attempts to hide them but does a poor job of it. This explains why he wasn't wearing them when he was found, and why the victim's blood was on them. It all fit. But the defense attorney, Rita Lepinimi, saw something else entirely. She asked the court to consider not what was on the shoes, but what wasn't. The crime scene was a bloodbath. The killer would have been walking on soft, possibly damp earth, covered in grass and leaves. Yet, when the shoes were examined, there was no blood whatsoever on the soles. Not a single drop. The defense posed a devastatingly simple question. How could Nils have committed this brutal, bloody massacre, walking around the tent, and not get a single speck of blood on the bottom of his shoes? It defied logic. Furthermore, the bloodstains that were found were only on the upper parts of the shoes. The defense argued this was far more consistent with the shoes being inside the tent during the attack, perhaps near the victims, where they were spattered with blood. Or even more plausibly, they argued the blood could have been transferred onto the shoes long after the crime. Remember, these items were stored as evidence for 44 years. The standards for evidence collection and preservation in 1960 were a world away from what they are today. Contamination wasn't just possible, it was likely. The DNA evidence, once the prosecution's trump card, was starting to look like a bluff. Then there was the eyewitness. A woman came forward claiming that on the morning of the murders, she had seen Nils and Seppo walking together away from the lake. She said they had a heated argument. This was meant to bolster the theory of a fight between the two boys. But under cross-examination, her testimony crumbled. She was admitting to remembering a specific fleeting moment from 44 years prior. Her story had changed multiple times in interviews with the police. She couldn't be sure of the time, the day, or even what the boys were wearing. The defense painted her not as a liar, but as an unreliable narrator, her memory warped and colored by the decades of media coverage and speculation. The prosecution also leaned heavily on a supposed confession. Years after the murders, long before he was a suspect, Nils was being questioned by police about an unrelated matter. During the interview, he allegedly said something to the officer like, "What's done is done. I'll get 15 years for it." The prosecution presented this as a slip of the tongue, a moment where his guilt bubbled to the surface. But the defense fired back. Was this a confession? Or was it the frustrated, fatalistic comment of a man whose entire life had been defined by a single horrific event? A man who was constantly hounded by the police and the media, who felt like he was being blamed no matter what he did. It was ambiguous, taken out of context, and a flimsy foundation on which to build a murder conviction. The defense wasn't just playing defense, though. They went on the attack. They brought in their own medical experts who examined the autopsy reports and Nils's own injuries. His broken jaw, the concussion, the stab wounds. The prosecution had tried to frame these as either self-inflicted or minor injuries sustained in a scuffle he had started. But the defense's experts came to a starkly different conclusion. Nils's injuries were severe, life-threatening, and entirely consistent with him being a victim of the same brutal, frenzied attack as his friends. He hadn't just been in a fight. He had been a victim of an attempted murder. His fractured jaw and cheekbones were not the kind of injuries you get in a simple fistfight. They were the result of being hit with a heavy, blunt object with immense force. The same kind of force that had crushed the skulls of his friends. And then there was the sheer psychology of it all. The prosecution wanted the jury to believe that a teenage boy, in a fit of drunken, jealous rage, murdered his girlfriend and his two best friends in the most brutal way imaginable. And then, in the middle of this supposed chaotic frenzy, he had the presence of mind to gather the murder weapons, a knife and a blunt object, along with several other personal items, and hide them so perfectly that an army of police officers and volunteers could never find them. And after all that, he just lay back down in the tent and waited to be found. It just didn't add up. The narrative was broken. As the trial progressed, the air in the courtroom shifted. The confident swagger of the prosecution faded, replaced by a sense of desperation. The public, once convinced of Nils's guilt, began to have doubts. If the case against the sole survivor was this weak, this full of holes and contradictions, then the police must have had the wrong man all along. And if Nils Gustafsson didn't do it, then who did? This question had haunted Finland for decades, and long before Nils was ever charged, the police had other specters in their files. Other names, other faces, other dark possibilities, and one name stood out more than any other. A man who lived so close to the lake, he could have heard the teenagers laughing around their campfire. A man known for his violent temper and his seething hatred for the very campers who met their end that night. His name was Carl Valdemar Gillström, but the locals knew him by a simpler, more ominous name, the Kiosk Man. Gillström ran a small kiosk on the shores of Lake Bodom. He sold lemonade, sausages, and cigarettes to the swimmers and campers who flocked to the area in the summer. And by all accounts, he despised them. He saw them as trespassers, noisy intruders who disrupted his peace and disrespected his property. He was known to be aggressive, to sabotage tents, throw rocks at people, and get into verbal, sometimes physical altercations with anyone he felt was out of line. He was the angry old man on the edge of the woods, a local boogeyman. The day after the murders, several witnesses reported seeing Gillström acting strangely. He seemed agitated, nervous. But the most suspicious act was what he did to the well in his yard. For no apparent reason, just hours after the bodies were discovered less than a mile away, Carl Gillström filled his well with dirt. It was a bizarre, inexplicable act. Why would someone suddenly fill in their own source of water? Unless, of course, they were trying to hide something. Something like a bloody knife in a rock. The police did interview Gillström back in 1960. They knew he was a local troublemaker. But his wife, who many believed was terrified of him, provided an alibi. She said he was home with her all night. With no evidence directly linking him to the scene, and with an alibi in hand, the police moved on. The kiosk man was dismissed as just another dead end. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, after Gillström had died by suicide in 1969, his wife allegedly told a neighbor a chilling secret. A secret she had kept locked away out of fear. She said that before he died, her husband had confessed everything to her. He had told her that he was the one who had murdered the teenagers at Lake Bodom. Another neighbor also came forward, claiming that Gillström had confessed to him as well while drunk at a party. "I'm the one who did it," he had slurred, a grim boast that was dismissed at the time as drunken nonsense. Suddenly, the police had a suspect with motive, opportunity, and multiple confessions. He was a violent man who hated campers and lived right next to the crime scene. He behaved suspiciously immediately after the murders, and allegedly admitted to the crime on his deathbed. He seemed in many ways like a far more plausible killer than a teenage boy who lost his friends and his memory. So why was he dismissed so quickly back in 1960? Why did the police accept his wife's questionable alibi without digging deeper? Was it just a case of tunnel vision, a simple but catastrophic mistake? Or was there another reason the police looked away from the angry man at the kiosk, allowing the real killer of Lake Bodom to take his secrets to the grave? To answer that question, we have to travel away from the angry kiosk man and his flimsy alibi, and turn our attention to a figure who seems ripped from the pages of a Cold War spy novel. A man so enigmatic, so shrouded in secrets, that his very existence complicates everything we thought we knew. Because while police were focused on local grudges and teenage disputes, a doctor in a nearby hospital was about to have an encounter that would haunt him for the rest of his life. An encounter that, years later, would make him believe he had met the devil himself on the morning of June 5, 1960. The man's name was Hans Assmann. On the surface, he was a German immigrant living in Finland. But dig a little deeper and the story gets dark fast. Whispers followed him everywhere he went. Rumors of a past life in the SS, of being a KGB operative, a man who moved through the shadows of European politics. He was, by all accounts, a ghost, a professional mystery. And on the morning the bodies were discovered at Lake Bodom, a man matching his description in a terrifying state walked into the Helsinki Surgical Hospital. The physician on duty was a young Jorma Palo. He would later become a renowned professor, but on that day, he was just a doctor trying to make sense of the bizarre patient in front of him. The man had arrived unannounced, his clothes filthy, his long blonde hair in a tangled mess. But it was his hands that caught the doctor's eye. His fingernails were pitch black, caked with dirt and what looked like dried blood. His behavior was even stranger. He was nervous, aggressive, and at times seemed to be faking unconsciousness. When Dr. Palo tried to question him, the man was evasive and hostile. The doctor noted the reddish stains on his clothing, which the man dismissed as paint. Dr. Palo, following procedure, had the man admitted, but the patient's odd behavior only escalated. Hospital staff reported seeing him using a small pair of scissors to frantically cut his long hair, as if trying to alter his own appearance. He was a puzzle of paranoia and pain. And then, as quickly and mysteriously as he had arrived, he was gone. He checked himself out against medical advice, leaving behind a baffled hospital staff and a story that, for years, seemed like nothing more than a strange footnote to a tragic day. For nearly 2 decades, that's all it was. A weird memory for Dr. Palo. Then, in the late 1970s, he saw a newspaper photograph of a man named Hans Assmann. The doctor froze. The face staring back at him from the page was older, more worn, but the eyes, the structure of the face, it was him. It was the man from the hospital. The man with the black fingernails and the blood-stained clothes who had appeared just hours after the murders, mere miles from Lake Bodom. Dr. Palo was certain. He had treated the killer. He immediately went to the police with his story, convinced he held the key to unlocking Finland's greatest mystery. But the police reaction was underwhelming. They listened, they took notes, but nothing happened. The case file remained cold. It was as if they didn't want to hear it. But Dr. Palo wasn't the only one who would link Hans Assmann to the crime. Another story emerged, this one even more chilling. A former police detective came forward, claiming that on his deathbed, Hans Assmann had confessed, not just to the Lake Bodom murders, but to a string of other notorious unsolved killings in Finland. It was a stunning claim. A dying man supposedly clearing his conscience, painting himself as one of the nation's most prolific serial killers. The detective alleged that Assmann described the Bodom attack in detail, a final, whispered confession from the man who had lived his life as a shadow. Suddenly, the pieces seemed to click into place. Assmann lived relatively close to Lake Bodom. His appearance, tall with blonde hair, matched the vague description of a man seen by birdwatchers leaving the area on the morning of the murders. His alleged KGB connections could explain why he was so skilled at evading capture, and perhaps why the authorities seemed so reluctant to pursue him. Could it be that simple? That the killer wasn't some local hothead, but a trained professional agent of chaos? The theory was intoxicating. It explained the brutality of the crime, the lack of a clear motive, and the killer's almost supernatural ability to vanish. Investigators who supported this theory pointed to Assmann's history. He was known to have a violent temper. His wife even told police that he had been out the night of the murders and had returned in the morning with his clothes torn and stained. She said she was too afraid of him to ask any questions. So here we have it. A doctor's positive identification of a suspicious patient on the morning of the murders. A supposed deathbed confession to a police officer. A wife too terrified to question her husband's bloody return home. Seems like an open and shut case. So why wasn't Hans Assmann ever charged? Why did he die a free man? Because like everything in this case, there's another side to the story. The police did officially question Hans Assmann back in 1961. They looked into him, and they cleared him. The reason? He had an alibi, a seemingly solid one. Assmann claimed he was at his girlfriend's apartment in Helsinki the entire night sleeping, and the girlfriend, when questioned separately, confirmed his story down to the last detail. For the police, an alibi is an alibi. Case closed. They moved on. But was it really that solid? Skeptics argue that a man like Assmann, a rumored spy, would be an expert at creating false alibis. His girlfriend could have been coerced, threatened into lying for him. After all, his own wife was admittedly terrified of him. And what about the hospital visit? Police records show they were aware of it, but they dismissed it. They accepted Assmann's explanation that he had simply been on a drunken binge and had fallen, injuring himself and getting dirty. The stains on his clothes? Just paint from a project. It all seemed a little too neat, a little too convenient. This is where the story veers into the territory of a full-blown conspiracy. Was Assmann protected? If he truly was a valuable KGB asset operating in Finland during the height of the Cold War, his arrest for a savage, but ultimately local murder would have created a massive international incident. It's possible that Finnish authorities were quietly told by their own intelligence agencies, or even by the Soviets themselves, to drop it, to look the other way. In this scenario, the lives of 3 teenagers were simply collateral damage in the great, silent game being played between superpowers. The police didn't have tunnel vision. They were wearing a blindfold that had been put on them by a higher authority. This theory that the killer was a protected foreign agent is a chilling one. It suggests a cover-up at the highest levels, a deliberate decision to sacrifice justice for political stability. It would explain why the investigation seemed to stall, why promising leads like Asman were so quickly dismissed on the back of a simple, uninterrogated alibi. And there's one more disturbing detail. Nils Gustafsson, the lone survivor, later described the attacker. He said the man's face was indistinct, almost a blur, but he remembered the eyes. He described them as bright, almost hypnotic. Years later, when shown a photograph of Hans Asman, some have claimed that Nils had a visceral, physical reaction. The connection is tenuous, based on hearsay, but it adds another layer of intrigue. Did the boy in the tent come face to face with a KGB assassin? Was the monster who destroyed his life the same phantom who haunted the fringes of Cold War Europe? Hans Asman took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind a legend as dark and murky as the waters of Lake Bodom itself. But he wasn't the last man the police would look at. In fact, the most shocking suspect was yet to come. A suspect who had been there all along, hiding in plain sight, his story of survival slowly, over decades, beginning to look like something else entirely. For 44 years, Nils Gustafsson was the boy who lived, the sole survivor, a national symbol of tragedy and resilience. He was the final indelible image of the Lake Bodom nightmare, a battered teenager found lying atop the collapsed tent, his life hanging by a thread. He was a victim. End of story. Until he wasn't. In March of 2004, the story that had defined a nation's darkest mystery was ripped apart. The Finnish National Bureau of Investigation, armed with new forensic techniques and a cold, hard look at the old evidence, came to a staggering conclusion. They arrested a 61-year-old bus driver, a husband and father living a quiet, unremarkable life. They arrested Nils Gustafsson. The accusation was unthinkable, that there was no phantom killer, no crazed madman stalking the shores of Lake Bodom. The killer, they claimed, had been inside the tent all along. The investigation that led to this moment was a masterclass in forensic archaeology, digging through a mountain of dusty files, re-examining witness statements, and most importantly, applying modern science to decades-old evidence. What they found were not answers but questions. Deep, troubling questions about Nils Gustafsson's own story. It all started to unravel with the shoes. Remember Nils's leather shoes? The ones found roughly 500 yards away from the campsite, tucked away under a rock. For years, they were just another piece of the puzzle, an item the killer had inexplicably taken and discarded. But the new investigators looked at them with fresh eyes. They noticed something strange. The shoes were in remarkably good condition. They weren't scuffed or damaged in a way you'd expect from a frantic chase through the woods. More importantly, the soles showed little to no dirt or wear from the surrounding terrain. It was as if they hadn't been worn during the attack or the escape at all. And then there was the blood. Forensic analysis revealed the blood of all three murdered victims, Ermeli, Tiliki and Seppo, was on the outside of Nils's shoes. How could that be? If an outside attacker had murdered his friends and then stolen his shoes, how did their blood get on them? The prosecution developed a chilling theory. The blood got on the shoes because Nils was wearing them after the murders, as he walked away from the tent to hide them, along with other items, to stage a robbery gone wrong. This theory reframed everything. The police went back to the original crime scene analysis. Nils was found on top of the tent, not inside it. His injuries, while serious, a concussion, a fractured jaw, and some bruises, were significantly less severe than the horrific overkill-style wounds inflicted on his friends. The other victims had been stabbed dozens of times, bludgeoned with unimaginable force. Nils's injuries, the new medical examiner suggested, were more consistent with a fist fight. A brutal, desperate fight, but a fight nonetheless. Not the work of a frenzied, knife-wielding maniac attacking sleeping teenagers. Suddenly, Nils's amnesia didn't look like a symptom of trauma. It looked convenient. His inability to describe the attacker wasn't because he was knocked out cold. It was because the police now believed there was no one to describe. The entire narrative of an external attacker began to crumble. If there was no attacker, then what really happened in that tent on June 5, 1960? The prosecution began to paint a new, terrifying picture of that night. They argued it wasn't a random act of violence, but a crime of passion, a social situation that had escalated. As the lead investigator put it, they pieced together a motive from scraps of information and teenage drama. Nils and Ermeli were a couple, but perhaps there was tension. Some accounts suggested Ermeli had been growing closer to Seppo. The police theorized that on that night, fueled by alcohol, a jealous rage erupted inside the tent. Their narrative went something like this. Nils gets into a furious argument with Seppo, possibly over Ermeli, turns physical. The two boys fight and Nils sustains his injuries, the broken jaw, the concussion, in this initial brawl. But Nils, in a fit of uncontrollable rage, snaps. He grabs a weapon, the rock, the knife, and attacks Seppo. The girls, waking to the horror, start screaming. To silence them, he turns on them too. It's a chaotic, explosive, and deeply personal eruption of violence. In this version of events, Nils isn't the victim. He's the perpetrator. After the frenzy subsides, a dazed and injured Nils realizes what he's done. He concocts a plan. He cuts the tent ropes, slashes the canvas from the inside to make it look like an outside attack. He takes off his blood-splattered shoes, gathers a few key items like the wallets, and walks away from the tent to hide them, creating the illusion of a robbery. He then returns to the campsite, lies down on the collapsed tent, and waits to be found, ready to play the part of the sole survivor. It was a horrifying theory, but it answered questions the Phantom Killer narrative never could. It explained the hidden shoes, the nature of his injuries, and the lack of a clear motive for any outsider. The final piece of the puzzle, the one the police believed would seal his fate, was DNA. In the early 2000s, DNA analysis was a powerful new tool unavailable in 1960. Investigators painstakingly re-examined the evidence. They tested the tent fabric, the victim's clothing, and crucially, Nils's hidden shoes. On the shoes, they found what they were looking for. The DNA profile from the bloodstains matched Ermeli, Tiliki, and Seppo. But there was more. They also found Nils's DNA mixed in with the blood of the others. To the prosecution, this was the smoking gun. His DNA mixed with theirs on the shoes he wore while hiding them. Case closed. They also pointed to a witness statement that had been overlooked for decades. An ex-girlfriend of Nils's came forward, claiming that shortly after the murders, he had confessed something to her. He had allegedly said, "What's done is done, I'll serve my 15 years. A statement he later dismissed as a dark, inappropriate joke. But in 2004, it no longer sounded like a joke. Sounded like a confession. The arrest of Nils Gustafsson sent shockwaves across Finland. It was the equivalent of a moon landing conspiracy theorist being proven right. The public was torn. How could the boy they had pitted for over 4 decades be the monster responsible? He had lived his whole life under the shadow of that night, a walking monument to the tragedy. Was it all a lie? A performance that lasted 44 years? The evidence was entirely circumstantial, but it was compelling. The prosecution felt they had finally solved the nation's most painful mystery. They had their man, and they were ready to take him to trial. The sole survivor of the Lake Bodom massacre was now the only suspect, and the stage was set for a legal battle that would captivate the world and decide, once and for all, what truly happened on that bloody shore. The trial of Nils Gustafsson began in August 2005, and it felt like the entire nation of Finland was packed into the Espoo District Court. This wasn't just a murder trial. It was the culmination of a 45-year-old national trauma. The air was thick with anticipation, a heavy silence hanging over the proceedings as the prosecution began to lay out its case. They had waited 4.5 decades for this moment, and they were confident. Their narrative was simple, brutal, and deeply personal. The prosecution's lead attorney painted a vivid picture of that night. He argued this wasn't the work of some phantom killer, some mysterious outsider. This was a crime of passion. The motive, he claimed, was jealousy. He presented a theory that Nils Gustafsson, drunk and rejected, had been pushed into a homicidal rage. The target of his affection, Ermeli Björklund, was allegedly spending more time with Seppo Boman, the supposed leader of their group. The prosecution suggested a heated argument had broken out. Words were exchanged, insults were hurled, and something inside Nils snapped. They claimed that in the dark of the tent, fueled by alcohol and fury, Nils attacked Seppo first. Then, in a frenzy, he turned on Ermeli and Tiliki, silencing them forever. He was an insider, which explained how the attack could have been so swift and brutal, catching everyone off guard inside the confines of their shared tent. But how did he end up looking like a victim himself? The prosecution had an answer for that too. They argued that Nils's injuries, while real, were not as severe as one would expect from the maniac who had just bludgeoned and stabbed 3 people to death. His fractured jaw and concussion, they theorized, were the result of a fight with Seppo before the murders, the very fight that sent him over the edge. The other cuts and bruises? The prosecution alleged they were either self-inflicted in a calculated attempt to stage the scene, or minor wounds sustained in the initial struggle. Then came the centerpiece of their new evidence, the reason this cold case was suddenly red hot: modern DNA analysis. Investigators had re-examined the evidence with technology that was pure science fiction in 1960. They had found blood from the other victims on Nils Gustafsson's belongings. Most damningly, on a pair of his leather shoes found 500 yards from the campsite, they found the DNA of Seppo Boiman and Tiliki Maki. But the prosecution's smoking gun was a bloodstain on the outside of the tent canvas. This stain contained a mixture of blood from Ermelie Bjorklund, the girl at the center of the alleged love triangle, and Nils Gustafsson. The prosecutor argued this mixture could only have occurred during a close-quarters, violent struggle. In their version of events, Nils was on top of Ermelie, attacking her, their blood mixing as he delivered the fatal blows. And what about the shoes? The ones found so far from the tent? The prosecution claimed Nils had committed the murders, taken the shoes off, walked barefoot to hide them along with the murder weapon, and then returned to the tent to play the part of the victim. The blood on the outside of the shoes, they argued, proved he wasn't wearing them during the attack. He was the killer, trying and almost succeeding to cover his tracks. It was a compelling story. It was neat. It tied up the loose ends that had tormented Finland for decades. For a moment, it seemed like the mystery was finally solved. The sole survivor was the secret perpetrator. But then it was the defense's turn. And for every pillar the prosecution had built, Nils Gustafsson's legal team had a wrecking ball. They started with the motive: jealousy. They called it what it was: pure speculation. They brought witnesses to the stand, friends who knew the group, who testified that there was no serious animosity. They were just teenagers camping and having a good time. The so-called love triangle was a dramatic invention by a prosecution desperate to create a motive where none existed. There was zero concrete evidence of a major fight that night. Next, they attacked the interpretation of Nils's injuries. The defense brought in medical experts who were stunned by the prosecution's theory. They testified that Nils's injuries were severe and life-threatening. A fractured jaw, a concussion, multiple stab wounds. These were not the kind of injuries a person could convincingly self-inflict or sustain in a simple fistfight. They were defensive wounds. They were the wounds of a victim who had fought for his life and barely survived. The idea that he could sustain these injuries, then have the clarity of mind to meticulously stage a crime scene, hide evidence hundreds of yards away, and then return to the tent to wait for hours, was, in their expert opinion, medically preposterous. Then came the DNA, the prosecution's trump card. The defense didn't dispute the DNA findings. They disputed the meaning. Of course, the victim's DNA was on Nils's belongings, and his on theirs. For people had been sharing a tiny, cramped tent for a weekend. Their DNA would be everywhere. The bloodstains on the shoes? The defense offered a far more plausible explanation. The killer, the real killer, had attacked from outside the tent. After the bloody assault, this unknown assailant, likely covered in blood, could have easily kicked or handled Nils's shoes, which were probably left just outside the tent door, transferring the victim's blood onto them. The fact that the shoes were hidden so far away didn't point to Nils. It pointed directly to an outsider. Why would Nils, in a supposed effort to frame an unknown attacker, hide his own shoes? It made no logical sense. A real killer, however, would have every reason to hide anything that might link him to the scene. And the blood mixture on the tent? The defense argued it proved the exact opposite of the prosecution's claim. If an attacker was stabbing and bludgeoning the occupants through the canvas from the outside, it's completely logical that the victim's blood would mix, both with each other's and with the fabric of the tent. If Nils was also being attacked inside, his blood would naturally be part of that chaotic mix. The DNA didn't prove Nils was the killer. It simply proved he was there, and that he was bleeding. Proved he was a victim. The defense then masterfully turned the prosecution's entire case on its head. They argued that by focusing so narrowly on Nils, the investigators had ignored a mountain of evidence pointing to an unknown assailant. What about the stolen items? Cash, watches, even Nils's wallet, all taken from the scene. If Nils was the killer, why would he steal from his dead friends and himself, only to discard some of the items nearby. What was the point? It was a nonsensical act for an insider, but a perfectly logical one for a robber. And most critically, where was the murder weapon? Or weapons? After 45 years and the most extensive investigation in Finnish history, no weapon had ever been found. The prosecution's theory required Nils, after suffering a fractured jaw and a concussion, to not only hide his shoes but also to dispose of a knife and a heavy blunt object so perfectly that they would never be discovered. The defense argued that the simplest explanation was usually the correct one. The weapons weren't found because the killer took them with him when he fled the scene. The prosecution had presented a story. It was a story of teenage angst and betrayal. But the defense argued it was just that, a story. A fiction built on circumstantial evidence and imaginative leaps of logic. The reality they claimed was far simpler and far more terrifying. An unknown person or persons had stumbled upon the tent that night and, for reasons unknown, unleashed an unimaginable fury upon the 4 teenagers inside. The prosecution's case against Nils Gustafsson, they concluded, was not just weak. It was an injustice, a desperate attempt to close a painful chapter by sacrificing the only other victim who had managed to survive it. The evidence was in, the arguments were made, and as the judges retreated to deliberate, Nils Gustafsson, now a gray-haired man in his 60s, sat silently, his fate, and the final word on Finland's greatest mystery, hanging in the balance. The air in the Espoo District Court was thick with 44 years of silence, speculation, and grief. Every person in that room, from the journalists scribbling in their notepads to the members of the public who had followed this case their entire lives, understood the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a verdict for one man. It was a verdict on a national trauma. The judges, 3 seasoned professionals, were tasked with the almost impossible: to look back across a chasm of 4 decades, through a fog of contaminated evidence and fading memories, and find the truth. They had to weigh the prosecution's narrative, a story of sudden explosive rage, a story where a teenage squabble over a girl, or perhaps some other trivial campsite drama, spiraled into a massacre. In this version of events, Nils Gustafsson, fueled by jealousy and alcohol, snapped. He attacked his friends, then in a moment of cold, calculated survival, inflicted wounds upon himself to create the illusion of being a victim. He then, according to the prosecution, took off his shoes, which were stained with his own blood but not the victim's, and hid them 500 meters away in the woods before returning to the tent to play possum. It was a dramatic theory, but was it plausible? The judges had to pick it apart piece by piece. First, the so-called new evidence, the DNA. The prosecution had made a huge deal about finding the victim's DNA on Nils's shoes. But the defense had expertly dismantled this. They pointed out that the 4 teenagers had been living in close quarters for a day. Of course their DNA would be mixed. It didn't prove a violent struggle. More damningly, the DNA of an unknown 5th person was also found. Who was that? The prosecution had no answer. Then there was the bloodstain analysis on the tent. The expert claimed the pattern showed the killer had been inside the tent, which contradicted Nils's story of an outside attacker. But this was an interpretation of stains on a piece of canvas that had been mishandled, stored improperly for decades, and was riddled with contamination. Could any conclusion drawn from it truly be beyond a reasonable doubt? The judges had to consider the very real possibility that the evidence was simply too old, too degraded to be reliable. And what about Nils's injuries? The prosecution argued they were superficial, self-inflicted. But medical experts, both at the time and during the trial, had confirmed he had a concussion, a fractured jaw, and multiple stab wounds. He was beaten so badly he had no memory of the event. To believe the prosecution, you had to believe that a teenage boy, after committing a horrific triple murder, had the presence of mind and the anatomical knowledge to fake a concussion and fracture his own jaw convincingly enough to fool doctors. Seemed a stretch. The most powerful argument for the defense, however, was the simplest, the complete and total lack of motive. The prosecution's theory of a jealous rage was pure speculation. There was no diary entry, no letter, no witness who could testify to any serious animosity between Nils and the others. They were just kids on a camping trip. To convict a man of a crime this monstrous, you need more than a guess about his state of mind 44 years earlier. You need proof. And the prosecution just didn't have it. Days turned into a week, then weeks. The nation waited. Finally, on October 7, 2005, the call came. The court was back in session. Nils Gustafsson, flanked by his lawyers, walked back into the courtroom. The cameras flashed. A storm of silent lightning. The room hushed as the three judges took their seats. The chief judge picked up a document, his face unreadable. He looked at Nils, then at the courtroom, and began to speak. He methodically went through the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. He spoke of the unreliability of the decades-old witness statements. He spoke of the inconclusive DNA findings. He noted the prosecution's failure to present a coherent motive that could explain such a brutal explosion of violence. He acknowledged Nils's own severe injuries, stating it was not proven that they were self-inflicted. He concluded that the evidence presented by the prosecution was not, in his words, sufficient or convincing. And then the final words that would echo across Finland: the charges are dismissed. Nils Gustafsson is acquitted of all charges. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Nils Gustafsson slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, as his lawyer patted his back. For the first time in 3 years, the cloud of suspicion that had reformed over his head had finally, definitively, been lifted by a court of law. He was a free man. Again. But the acquittal was not a declaration of innocence. It was a declaration of insufficient proof. The court didn't say, Nils Gustafsson did not commit these murders. It said, the prosecution has failed to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that he did. It's a critical distinction. The verdict left a void. The state was ordered to pay Nils Gustafsson €44,900 in compensation for the mental suffering caused by the lengthy trial. A small sum for having your life turned upside down and being publicly accused of the murder of your first love and your two best friends. After the verdict, Nils gave a brief statement to the press. He said, I am a very relieved person. I knew this would be the outcome from the start. It was a tough time, but now it's over. For him it was over. But for Finland it wasn't. The verdict was a bombshell that satisfied no one. For those who believed in his guilt, it was a miscarriage of justice, a feeling that a killer had gotten away with it for a second time. For those who believed in his innocence, it was a profound relief, but also a source of anger. Why was this man, a victim himself, put through this ordeal 44 years later on such flimsy evidence? And for everyone else, the vast majority of people caught in the middle, the acquittal simply reset the clock. It erased the only official answer the authorities had ever put forward. The slate was wiped clean, but the bloodstains remained. The trial of the century had ended not with a bang, but with a return to the same haunting silence that had descended over Lake Bodom on that June morning in 1960. The court had closed the book on Nils Gustafsson, but in doing so, they had reopened the most terrifying question of all. If the sole survivor, the man inside the tent, wasn't the killer, then who was? The answer had to be outside the tent. And as investigators and amateur sleuths turned their gaze away from Nils, they began to look back into the shadows of the past, at the other faces, the other names, that had been whispered in connection with the Bodom murders for decades. The specter of an unknown, phantom killer was once again stalking the Finnish consciousness. With Nils Gustafsson a free man, the Finnish public and the police were forced to confront a deeply unsettling reality. If the lone survivor wasn't the killer, then the monster of Lake Bodom, the faceless man from the sketch, the phantom in the woods, had gotten away with it. He had watched from the shadows for 45 years as an innocent man was blamed, and he had remained silent. The investigation, thrown back to square one, had no choice but to dust off the old files, to look again at the names that had been dismissed, forgotten, or simply lost in the fog of time. First, and perhaps most compelling, was a man who has become a fixture in Bodom lore. Carl Gillström, known to locals simply as the Kiosk Man. Gillström ran a small kiosk on the Oita camping ground, not far from the murder site. And by all accounts, he hated the campers. He was a known recluse, a man with a reputation for being short-tempered, aggressive, and openly hostile to anyone setting up a tent near his property. He'd been seen cutting tent ropes, throwing rocks, and screaming at people to leave. His simmering rage was a local legend. This general animosity alone wouldn't make him a suspect, but the stories that swirled around him in the days and years after the murders were chilling. Several witnesses claimed that on the morning after the attack, Gillström seemed agitated and nervous. More disturbingly, his wife later confided in a neighbor that on the night of the murders, Her husband had been out. He had forbidden her from asking where he went. When he returned, his clothes were a mess, and he had visible scratches. Years later, the story took an even darker turn. According to multiple sources, including his own neighbors, Gyllström made a drunken confession. In a slurred, rambling tirade, he supposedly admitted to the killings. "I'm the one who did them," he reportedly said, his words thick with alcohol and venom. The neighbor he confessed to was so disturbed that he went to the police, but at the time, the lead was seemingly dismissed. The most bizarre piece of the Gyllström puzzle, however, is the well. Shortly after the murders, for reasons he never explained, Carl Gyllström filled in the well on his property with dirt and stones. It was a strange, laborious, and seemingly pointless act. To investigators and armchair detectives, it screamed of concealment. Was he burying evidence? The murder weapon? Bloody clothes? The police even searched the well years later, but found nothing of significance. So why wasn't the kiosk man ever arrested? The answer is frustratingly simple. He had an alibi. A solid one. His wife, the same woman who later claimed he was out that night, initially told police that he had been home with her the entire time. She swore he never left her side. This alibi, given so early in the investigation, was enough to steer the police away from him. It was only much later, after Gyllström's death, that she recanted, telling a new story of his mysterious absence. By then it was too late. Carl Gyllström took his own life in 1969, just 9 years after the murders. If he was the killer, his secrets were buried with him, perhaps as deliberately as the stones he'd packed into his well. But Gyllström wasn't the only ghost haunting the investigation. Another, more enigmatic figure lurked at the fringes of the case. A man who seemed to have walked straight out of a Cold War spy novel. Hans Assmann. Assmann was a German immigrant living in Finland, and he was widely suspected of being a KGB operative. His life was a tapestry of secrets and shadows. But it was his actions on June 6, 1960, the day after the murders, that placed him squarely in the crosshairs of suspicion. On that day, Assmann walked into the Helsinki Surgical Hospital, the very same hospital where Nils Gustafsson would later be treated. His appearance was alarming. His clothes were stained, his fingernails were black with dirt, and he was acting erratically, almost deliriously. The doctor who treated him, Jorma Palo, was immediately suspicious. Assmann's story was disjointed and strange, and he couldn't seem to account for his disheveled state. Dr. Palo, having heard news reports of the brutal attack at Lake Bodom, felt a chill run down his spine. The man in front of him looked eerily like the vague descriptions of the killer. He was tall, blonde, and had the piercing eyes that would later be immortalized in the Phantom sketch. Dr. Palo did what any responsible citizen would do. He called the police. He reported his deep suspicions about his strange patient. The police response, or lack thereof, has become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Bodom investigation. According to Dr. Palo, the police interviewed Assmann briefly but quickly dismissed him as a suspect. They allegedly told the doctor they had more interesting leads to follow, and that Assmann was just a weirdo, not a killer. They didn't even confiscate his stained clothing for testing. This apparent fumble allowed Assmann to slip back into the shadows. But his name would resurface again and again over the decades. Amateur sleuths and even some former investigators believe he was the real killer, possibly protected by his connections. They point to his history of alleged violence and the fact that he was a suspect in several other unsolved Finnish murders from the same era, including the infamous Kalikisari case. He fit the profile of a predator, a man who could blend in and disappear. Years later, just before his death in 1998, Assmann allegedly confessed to the Bodom murders to a Finnish journalist. The confession, like Gyllström's, was rambling and lacked specific details that could definitively prove his guilt. Was it the final unburdening of a guilty soul, or the last desperate bid for infamy from a lifelong manipulator? Like Gyllström, Assmann provided an alibi for the night of the murders, claiming he was at his home in Espoo with his wife. And like Gyllström, his wife supported this alibi. Without physical evidence to contradict it, the police had nothing to go on. Hans Assmann remained a phantom, a tantalizing what-if in a case full of them. Beyond these two primary figures, the list of potential suspects is a long and desperate one. There was the man seen fishing near the causeway early that morning, a man who was never identified. There was talk of a group of local boys who had been harassing campers in the area. There was even a theory that the killer was a patient who had escaped from a nearby mental institution. Each lead was a promising path that ultimately led to a dead end. Every person of interest either had an alibi, or there was simply no evidence to connect them to the crime. The acquittal of Nils Gustafsson in 2005 didn't solve the mystery. It reset it. It sent everyone back to the beginning, to that bloody tent on that sunny June morning. It forced them to look at the kiosk man, a man consumed by a localized petty rage. It forced them to look at the alleged spy, a man of international intrigue and chilling charisma. Both men are dead. Both had alibis that were later questioned. Both fit the profile of the killer in their own way. One a monster of mundane provincial hatred, the other a monster of calculated worldly evil. With the only person ever charged for the crime now exonerated, the case file for the Lake Bodom murders was effectively closed. The trail had gone cold 45 years ago, and now it was frozen solid. The physical evidence was degraded, the witnesses' memories were faded, and the prime suspects were in their graves. The phantom killer had won. He had slipped through the grasp of justice and vanished back into the forest, leaving behind nothing but 3 bodies, 1 traumatized survivor, and a nation haunted by a question it could not answer. The investigation was over, but the story was entering a new, darker chapter. It was no longer just a crime, it was becoming a permanent part of the Finnish psyche, a national nightmare from which the country could never seem to wake. The years turned into decades. Lake Bodom became more than a place. It became a warning, a ghost story told around campfires to scare teenagers. The murders were woven into the fabric of the nation, a piece of dark folklore. Every Finn knew the story. Every Finn had a theory. The killer was a local madman, a Soviet spy, a jealous ex-boyfriend. The theories were endless because the truth was absent. The case file grew thicker with speculation and dead ends, gathering dust on a shelf in a police archive. The collective hope for justice slowly faded, replaced by a resigned acceptance of the mystery. The Bodom murders were Finland's open wound, a scar that refused to heal. For 44 years it seemed that was how the story would end. A tragic, brutal, and eternally unsolved crime. And then in March of 2004, a lightning bolt struck the heart of Finland. After more than 4 decades of silence, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation held a press conference. An arrest had been made. The country held its breath. Who was it? Was it the kiosk man? Had Hans Assmann's secrets finally been uncovered? The answer was more shocking than anyone could have possibly imagined. The suspect wasn't some long-lost drifter or a deathbed confessor. The person arrested and charged with 3 counts of murder was the sole survivor, Nils Wilhelm Gustafsson. The nation was stunned. The boy who had survived the horror, the man who had carried the trauma his entire life, was now being accused of being the monster himself. It felt like a betrayal of the narrative everyone had accepted for generations. How could this be? The police revealed their new theory, a chilling reinterpretation of the night's events. They claimed that new forensic technology, specifically DNA analysis, had shed new light on the old evidence. They argued that there was no outside attacker. The carnage, they said, was the result of an internal explosion of rage. The prosecution's case went like this. There had been a fight between Nils and another boy, Seppo, perhaps over one of the girls, Ermeli. In a fit of jealous fury, Nils committed the first murder. To eliminate the witnesses, he then brutally killed the other 2, Anya and Seppo. In this version of events, his own injuries were self-inflicted, or perhaps sustained during the initial struggle with Seppo, and then exaggerated to create the illusion of being a victim. The police pointed to a statement made by a woman who claimed Nils had drunkenly confessed to her years after the event, saying something along the lines of, "What's done is done. I got a life sentence." They also highlighted inconsistencies in Nils's story over the years, chalking them up not to trauma-induced amnesia, but to the lies of a guilty man. The key piece of physical evidence they presented was a re-examination of Nils's shoes. The victim's blood was found on the shoes, but here's the critical part. The shoes were found outside the tent about 500 meters away, along with some of Nils's clothing. The prosecution argued that only the killer could have taken them off and hidden them after the murders. And crucially, there was no blood from the 4th unknown attacker on those shoes. If an outsider had attacked the tent, a struggle would have ensued, and the killer's blood would likely be present. But there was none. There was only the blood of the 4 teenagers. The case, they argued, was a closed circle. The trial began in August 2005, and it captivated Finland. Nils Gustafsson, now a quiet bus driver in his 60s with a family of his own, stood in the dock, facing the ghosts of his youth. His defense team came out swinging. They systematically dismantled the prosecution's case, calling it a fantasy built on desperation and a desire to close a case that had embarrassed Finnish law enforcement for decades. First, the motive. A teenage squabble? They argued it was pure speculation, a flimsy and generic reason to explain an act of unbelievable brutality. There was no concrete evidence of any serious conflict that night. Second, the alleged confession. The defense pointed out it was hearsay, a vague comment made while intoxicated, and the witness's credibility was questionable. Then they attacked the physical evidence. Nils's injuries were severe: a concussion, fractured jaw and facial bones, and stab wounds. The defense brought in medical experts who testified that it would be nearly impossible for him to inflict such extensive and specific injuries on himself, and then have the presence of mind to hide his shoes and clothing hundreds of meters away before collapsing. It defied logic. But the defense's trump card was the very same technology the prosecution had used to build its case: DNA. While Nils's DNA was, unsurprisingly, found at the scene, so was something else. New analysis of a pillowcase found inside the tent revealed seminal fluid containing DNA from an unknown male who was not Nils Gustafsson, Seppo Boiman, or any other known individual connected to the case. Furthermore, DNA analysis of Nils's shoes showed the blood of all 3 victims, but not a single drop of Nils's own blood. The defense posed a devastating question. If Nils was the killer and had been injured in the fight, how could his shoes be covered in the victim's blood, but be completely clean of his own? It suggested he wasn't wearing them during the attack. It suggested someone else was. The defense argued that this unknown DNA proved what they had believed all along. There was an outsider, a phantom who had slipped into the campsite, committed a horrific act of violence, and vanished back into the woods, leaving behind a legacy of pain and confusion. They argued that the police, unable to find this phantom, had decided to turn the only victim they had left into the villain. The trial lasted 2 months. The entire country watched, torn between the official narrative and the man who claimed to be the final victim. In October 2005, the verdict came down. The court found the prosecution's case to be inconclusive and not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence was too circumstantial, the passage of time too great, the inconsistencies too vast. Nils Gustafsson was acquitted of all charges. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the shadow of suspicion would never truly leave him. The Finnish state even paid him over 44,000 euros in compensation for the mental suffering caused by the lengthy remand and trial. And so the circle closed. The one official attempt to solve the mystery in the modern era had ended in failure, collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The acquittal of Nils Gustafsson didn't bring clarity. It plunged the case back into the darkness, put everything back on the table. If it wasn't Nils, then who was it? Was it Carl Gillström, the kiosk man, who hated campers and was seen by some filling in a well on his property the morning after? He confessed on his deathbed, but was he a tormented killer or a delusional alcoholic? Was it Hans Assmann, the alleged KGB spy, the man who fit the witness description and showed up at a hospital covered in dirt and blood? His alibi was flimsy, but no physical evidence ever tied him to the scene. Or was it someone else entirely? A faceless drifter, a local deviant, a person who committed the perfect crime and simply walked away, their identity forever lost to time. Today, the Lake Bodom murders remain officially unsolved. The case is cold, the leads are exhausted, and the primary figures are gone. What we are left with is a story about a summer night that went horribly wrong, and the decades of questions that followed. It's a chilling reminder that the line between a peaceful evening and unspeakable violence can be as thin as a canvas tent wall. The mystery endures not just because of the lack of answers, but because of what it represents: the terrifying randomness of violence, the fallibility of memory, and the fear of the unknown that lurks just outside the glow of the campfire. The truth of what happened on June 5, 1960, didn't die with the victims. It lives on, locked away in a memory that can't be accessed, or in a secret that will never be told. It has become Finland's enduring nightmare, a national ghost story where the final terrifying chapter was never written.